What if I told you that the story of Teyvat didn't begin with Celestia, or even with the Primordial One? After finishing the Frost Moon's world quest and reading the Moongazer's engraving, I started noticing something strange. It looks like Hoyoverse has been telling us one continuous story across the multiple civilizations. A story that begins long before the Teyvat and may eventually explain the abyss, the false sky, and even the travelers themselves. Now, this isn't a confirmed lore, it's simply the timeline I pieced together after connecting the clues the game gave us. So let's start from the very beginning of the world quest. According to the Moongazer's engraving, the oldest civilization we know about wasn't in Teyvat at all. It was ruled by an immortal named Krell. Have you ever wondered why almost every ancient civilization in Genshin Impact ends the same way? Until the new Frost Moon World Quest introduced yet another forgotten civilization, but the difference is that it's not from our Teyvat. We are talking about a completely different civilization. At first I thought it was just another tragic story, but after reading the Moongazer's engravings, I started noticing something I couldn't ignore. What if none of these civilizations are separate stories? What if they are all connected by a single warning that's been traveling across the stars for thousands of years? And if that's true, then this book might contain the oldest story Hoyo has ever told. Let's start from the beginning. According to the Moongazer's engraving, the oldest civilization we know about wasn't in Teyvat. It was ruled by an immortal named Krell. The engraving tells us that before he became a ruler, he fought a brutal war of succession against 7 powerful monsters. Only after defeating all 7 did he unite the world under a single empire. For the first time, the civilization entered an age of peace. Knowledge advanced, technology flourished, and eventually they reached the stars. But instead of finding another civilization, they found something that would eventually destroy their own. Calls it only one thing: the Dark Destroyer. The game never explains what this entity is. Was it a creature, a force of nature, something related to the abyss? We simply don't know yet. What we do know is that even this incredibly advanced civilization eventually realized they couldn't defeat it. Instead of building a super weapon, instead of preparing for one last battle, they chose to leave behind a warning. Think about it for a moment. A civilization capable of exploring the stars decided that its greatest achievement wasn't a weapon, it was a message. They encoded everything they had learned and sent it into the sea of stars, hoping that someone, anyone, would receive it before suffering the same fate. Eventually, that civilization disappeared. Whether they were destroyed by the Dark Destroyer or something else happened, the engraving doesn't tell us. But their message survived. And that is where I think the timeline became really interesting. Because the next civilization didn't write the warning, they inherited it. According to my interpretation, another civilization eventually interpreted that transmission. They decoded it, they understood the fate of the civilization that came before them. But they also realized another problem. Language don't last forever. Even if the warning survived, eventually nobody would be able to read it. So instead of preserving the message as words, I think they preserved it as memories. This is where the mysterious stellar black entity enters the story. The quest never directly explains what that entity is, but if we connect the clues, the possibility is that civilization merged the warning with the entity itself, turning the message into something alive. Not a book, not a stone tablet, a living archive. But before they disappeared, they repeated exactly what the previous civilization has done. They transmitted the warning once again. This time, a signal would eventually reach the frozen moon, and that's where the Frost Moon story begins. Before we talk about Ungien, though, we need to talk about someone else, the researcher whose work made the project Moongazer possible in the first place, Nibelung. One detail that really stood out to me during the Frost Moon quest is that Nibelung and Ungien were trying to answer the same question, but they arrived at a completely different conclusion. After the Dragon King Nibelung left for the Sea of the Stars, Nibelung believed that one day his king would contact his people again. So he built a Frost Moon greatest achievement, the Eye of the Nibelung. From what we know, the Eye wasn't just a telescope, it was a massive listening station, constantly scanning the Sea of the Stars for signals. Imagine dedicating your entire life to listen for a single message. That's exactly what Ibn Balam did. He received a signal from the sky and believed that it was from their king, and he just build this massive station just to hear that signal again. But that voice never came. He waited, he continued his research, and eventually he died without ever receiving another transmission. At first, that might sound like the end of his story, but in reality, it was only the beginning. Years later, the eye detected something again, a signal. If Ibn Nibelung had been still alive, he probably would have believed it was finally Nibelung calling home. But the person who received that signal wasn't Ibn Nibelung. It was Ungien. And unlike his predecessor, Ungien noticed something unusual. Transmission didn't resemble anything produced by dragonkind. Its structures were different, its patterns were different. Whoever sent this message wasn't trying to speak like dragons. This led Ungien to a conclusion that completely changed the Frostmoon's history. He believed it's a signal that had came from another civilization, not another nation on Teyvat. Race living somewhere on the continent, a civilization somewhere beyond the Sea of the Stars. If he was right, Frostmoon had just become the first civilization in history to receive a message from another world. Naturally, they wanted answers. That decision eventually became Project Moongazer. Their objective wasn't to conquer the another world or search the new resources. It was much simpler than that. Find whoever sent the signal. Understand what they're trying to say. For that mission, Frostmoon built the spacecraft Moongazer. With everything prepared, Ungien departed. And then nothing. No reports, no messages, no requests for help, and years passed. As far as Frostmoon was concerned, Moongazer has disappeared into the Sea of the Stars. And one day, the researchers noticed something strange happening in the Frostmoon's atmosphere. At first, they couldn't explain it. There were disturbances, but nothing's visible. Eventually, they realized the disturbance was being caused by something hidden. The Moongazer has returned. It was cloaked with an invisible veil, concealing it almost until the moment it reached Frostmoon. But when the researchers boarded the ship, they immediately realized something was wrong. Ungien had returned, but he wasn't the same man who had left. Somewhere during the journey, he had merged with the mysterious stellar black entity. The game never explains exactly how this happened. Did the entity attack him? Did it choose him? Or did Ungien make that decision himself? But I personally think the third option makes the most sense. If the entity truly carried the warning left behind by the previous civilization, then there may be no way to translate it through ordinary language. Ungien wasn't trying to become something else, he was just trying to understand, and in order to understand, he willingly became the part of the message itself. Ironically, that solves one problem while creating another. Ungien could now understand the warning, but nobody else could. At this point, another person became incredibly important to the story, Magi Sketi. Most of the people would probably look Ungien and see a failed expedition. Some might even see him as a monster, but Magi saw something differently. She believed her husband was still there, somewhere beneath the influence of that spiky black entity. Ungien's consciousness was still alive, waiting to be reached. While Frostmoon itself was slowly descending into the civil war, Magi devoted herself to a completely different battle. She went to bring Ungien back. Not permanently, just long enough for him to tell everyone what he learned. According to the quest, she performed experiments in an attempt to restore him. Eventually, she succeeded. For a brief moment, Ungien wake up. Unfortunately, this is also where the game becomes intentionally vague. We only know Ungien managed to deliver his message. What we don't know is what the message actually was. Whoever's leaves that part completely unanswered. So from here on, I'm sharing my own interpretation. Well, if we go all the way to the beginning of this timeline, every civilization we have talked about encountered the same unknown threat. Yesnakarel's civilization, the civilization that inherited the warning, and finally the Frostmoon. That makes me think Ungien wasn't describing a complete new discovery. He was repeating the same warning that had already crossed the stars for countless generations. The warning had simply reached another civilization. Personally, I think the strongest candidate for the Dark Destroyer mentioned in the Moongazer's engraving is the Abyss. I'm not saying the game confirms this, it doesn't. But when we compare what engraving describes with what we have seen throughout the history, the similarities are difficult to ignore. Again and again, the Abyss corrupts civilization. Again and again, the advanced societies fell after coming into the contact with the forbidden knowledge. Again and again, the history repeats itself. To me, those parallels are too significant to ignore. After delivering his message, Ungien's body finally began to fail. His journey had come to an end. At this point, Magi faced a decision that I don't think any researchers would even make. She could let Ungien die, or she could preserve what remained of him My interpretation is this is where the first artificial Kohenki was created, not as a weapon, not as a machine built for war, but as an attempt to preserve his beloved of someone who had sacrificed everything to bring humanity a warning. His memories were gone, his personality was gone, but his consciousness remained. Years passed, eventually Maggie herself reached the end of the life. However, her research didn't disappear with her. It was inherited by her student, Lucilim. Lucilim is one of the most mysterious figures in this entire timeline. He inherited the Project Moongazer, he inherited Maggie's research, and more importantly, he inherited the truth that Ungien had sacrificed himself to uncover something. Living reminds of the people who first uncovered the warning beyond the stars. But while all of this was happening on the Frost Moon, the history was changing somewhere else. The Dragon King Nibelung had returned from the Sea of the Stars, but according to the lore we currently have, he didn't return alone. He returned carrying the forbidden power connected to the Abyss. That single event would eventually lead one of the greatest war in the Teyvat's history. The arrival of the Heavenly Principles, the fall of the Dragonkind, and according to my theory, the creation of the false sky itself. Before we continue, I want to slow down for a second. Everything we have discussed so far follows a fairly clear sequence. We start with Yasnaquil's civilization, and then the unknown civilization that preserved the warning, and finally the Frost Moon, where Ungien sacrificed himself to understand it. This part of the timeline is much harder to piece together because Hoyo hasn't given us a complete records of the events. So from this point onward, I am connecting different pieces of the lore that I think fit together, and you don't have to agree with my conclusions, but I'd like to explain why I reached it. The next major event is the return of the Nibelung. We know that Nibelung left Teyvat and ventured in the Sea of the Stars in search of power. When he returned, he wasn't the same Dragon King who had left. The lore tells us he brought back a forbidden power associated with the Abyss. Exactly what happened during the journey is still one of the Genshin's biggest mystery. Did he willingly seek the power? Or was he corrupted by it? Or was he trying to save the Dragonkind? Right now we simply don't know. But what we do know is that his return led to a war unlike anything Teyvat has seen before. The Heavenly Principle arrived. They have somehow earned the trust of the Moon Sisters, and the Moon Sisters gave the Heavenly Principles the permission to rebuild the civilization. After watching the Heavenly Principles ruling the world, he felt betrayed by the Moon Goddesses and he imprisoned them to use them as a weapon later on. He went to the dark side of the moon, built that giant railgun to shoot directly at the Teyvat. That is what catched the attention of the Heavenly Principles, and they fought Nibelung. Dragonkind was defeated. After that conflict, the order we know associates with Celestia began to take shape. Most people stop the timeline here, but I don't think Frost Moon is unrelated to these events. In fact, I think the timeline is too interesting to ignore. By this point, Lucilim possesses the accumulated knowledge of the Project Moongazer. He knew about Ungien, he knew about Maggie's research, and if my interpretation is correct, he also knew the warning that has crossed multiple civilizations. The game tells us that Lucilim eventually surrendered to Heavenly Principle. What it doesn't tell us is why he had no choice. Maybe he believed a resistance was impossible after seeing the defeat of the Dragonkind, or maybe he believed the Heavenly Principles was genuinely trying to protect the world. At this moment, we don't have enough information to answer that question. Earlier in this video, I mentioned the Moongazer was cloaked. At the time, it seems like a small detail, but I'd like to come back to it, not by making it invisible in a magical sense, but by concealing it from detection. I think the previous civilization where Ungien has escaped from might have this technology that they have given him to hide from the all-watching Dark Destroyer. When he brought back that technology, the group started to experiment a such thing by creating the Ungien Circle. Now think about it, another mystery in Genshin, the false sky. For years, players have wondered what false sky actually is. Is it an illusion, a barrier, a prison? The game hasn't given us a complete answer. So here's the connection that caught my attention. What if the technology that covered the Moongazer didn't disappear with Frost Moon? What if Lucilim handed the research over to Heavenly Principle, and that research was this invisible cloak? And what if that technology was expanded from hiding one spacecraft to hiding an entire world. Personally, I think that's one of the most interesting possibilities introduced by the Frost Moon quest. Instead of viewing the false sky as something created to imprison the humanity, I started wondering what if it was built to protect the humanity instead. Think back to the civilizations we have already discussed. Every one of them encountered a same mysterious threat. Every one of them eventually fall. If the heavenly principle also became aware of that threat, then hiding Teyvat suddenly makes a lot of sense. Not as an act of oppression, but as an act of survival. Of course, that raises many questions. If the false sky was protecting Teyvat, then why did the divine nail exist and all that? For a long time, I saw the nails as nothing more than weapons sent to punish civilizations. Now I'm not so sure. If the abyssal corruption threatens to spread through the world, then perhaps nails have another purpose. Containment. Every time corruption grows beyond the control, another nail descends, not simply to destroy, but to seal, to stop the corruption from spreading even further. Again, this is only my interpretation, but I think it explains the patterns better than viewing every nail as a simple punishment. Unfortunately, if the heavenly principle succeeded in protecting Teyvat, the protection didn't last forever because 500 years ago, a nation called Khaenri'ah unknowingly stepped in the same cycle that had already destroyed the civilization long before it. That is where I think the final piece of the timeline begins. If everything we have talked about so far is even partially correct, then Khaenri'ah wasn't the beginning of the story. It was simply the last civilization to repeat it. When most people think about Khaenri'ah, they think about the cataclysm 500 years ago, but I think the cataclysm started much earlier than that, not in terms of time, but in terms of cause. The first domain may have fallen when Yasna-Grel civilization encountered the Dark Destroyer. Even civilizations after that inherited the consequences. Khaenri'ah was simply one that couldn't stop them anymore. And now let's talk about the travelers. This is probably most speculative part of the entire video. Don't take this as established lore. It's simply the interpretation that makes most sense to me after putting the timelines together. We know Aether and Lumine aren't from Teyvat. They are the travelers between the worlds. We also know that the time the opening cutscene happens, Lumine already knows far more about the Teyvat than Aether does. That means something has happened before the game ever begins. Here's how I currently think those events are unfolded. Lumine awakes first, while Aether remains asleep as she encountered the people of the Khaenri'ah. Whether they found her by chance or deliberately sought her out, we don't know. But imagine seeing someone who wasn't affected by your world's rule, someone who had crossed countless worlds before arriving yours, someone who might have even possessed the ability to resist the abyssal corruption. Wouldn't you want to understand them? Wouldn't you want their help? That's why I think Lumine became closely connected with Khaenri'ah long ago before the cataclysm. Not because she wanted power, but because she believed she could help. Then everything went wrong. We know 5 sinners accepted the forbidden power. We know they abandoned their king, and we know that their actions were deeply connected to the Khaenri'ah's downfall. Exactly what happened behind the scene is still unknown, but whatever they discovered, it wasn't something humanity was prepared to control. And if my theory is correct, then Khaenri'ah didn't create the threat, it reopened the door that previous civilization has desperately tried to keep closed. And once that happened, history repeated itself again. The abyss spread, a monster appeared across the land, the heavenly principle responded. The cataclysm began. Now here's another question that has always bothered me. Why did the sustainer of the heavenly principle stop the twin from leaving? Think about it. If heavenly principle simply wanted to eliminate them, they could have done so immediately. Instead, they separated them. One remained asleep, the other continued living in Teyvat. That decision has always felt intentional. Personally, I don't think the travelers were trapped because they were enemies. I think they were trapped because they were important. Maybe the heavenly principle understood something about the travelers that nobody else did. Maybe they knew their ability to purify the abyssal energy that would become essential in the future. Or maybe they simply cannot risk letting the two beings who knew the truth leave the Teyvat. At this point, there isn't enough evidence to say for certain. But it's a question I think worth asking. Finally, we came to Lumine herself. One of the biggest debate in the community is why she chose the Abyss. Personally, I don't think she was corrupted. I think she made a choice. There is an important difference. If Lumine has simply been consumed by the Abyss, then her actions would have been easy to explain. But Throughout the story, she behaves like someone following a plan. She speaks calmly, she recognizes ether, she remembers their journey. She doesn't act like someone who has lost herself. She acts like someone carrying a burden. And that's why I don't think her goal is to destroy Teyvat. I think her goal is to end the cycle. If she's seen the civilization after civilization fall to the same threat, if she understands the truth behind the false sky, then maybe she believes hiding isn't enough anymore, and maybe she believes the only way to save the future civilization is to confront the source directly. Even if that means destroying the system that has been restricting Teyvat until now. Whether she is right or wrong, I have no idea. Only Hoyoverse can answer that. But after finishing the Frost Moon quest, I don't think the Moongazer engraving is just another lore book anymore. I think it's the first chapter of the story that's been unfolding for thousands, maybe even millions of years. A story about the civilization inheriting the same warnings. Maybe I have connected the dots correctly, maybe I'm completely wrong. That's just the fun of the Genshin lore. Even the new quest changes how we look at the old one. So I'd love to hear what you think. Did I miss something? Is there another interpretation that explains these events better? Or do you think the Moongazer's engraving is a point towards something even bigger than anyone of us has imagined? So now I'd like to hear your thoughts. Did I overlook an important detail? Did you notice another connection that supports or contradicts the timeline? Or did you have a complete different interpretation of what Dark Destroyer, the Stellar Black Entity, or the False Sky really are? I generally love to read your theories because some of the best lore discussion happens in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive and want to see more Genshin lore videos like this, consider subscribing. I have a feeling Frost Moon Quest is only the beginning and there are still plenty of mysteries waiting to be uncovered. And I'll see you in the next video.